Good afternoon. Welcome back. We're going into the second half of our course now, and Donna Waller is going to be our guide. I wanted to give you just a little background on Donna before we begin. Many of you know her. She's seen many of her friends already here today, but Donna grew up in Florida, in Sanford, which is down by Orlando. In the time before Disney was king of everything in the world down there. After she graduated from high school, there's a little different twist in her life because she was off to Barnard College in New York City, where she graduated with a BA in government. Then she came back to Florida, went down to the University of South Florida, where she got a degree, a master's in political science. And from there up to Gainesville. From there up to Gainesville. She went to UF and started working on a PhD in political theory. But about that time, in 1985, she also started teaching part-time out at Santa Fe College. And I think that's when she found her true calling, which is active classroom teaching, working with students, being in the classroom. And so she committed at that time to Santa Fe, got on tenure track, teaching government, political theory, honors courses. And by 2012, when she retired, she was a full professor. She's really one of Santa Fe's stars, without a doubt. In one of her last classes, they have the students rate your professors. In a class of 60, 55 rated her as awesome. So I can tell you we're in for a big, big treat today as Donna takes us back to 1912 and where Teddy Roosevelt tried to reemerge and catch lightning in the bottle one last time. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to Donna Waller, and please give her a good welcome.
Hi, everybody. A lot of you know me, and I just confessed to a couple of people. This is maybe my first live performance in almost 4 years. And despite the fact that I did this for a living for ages and ages, I was nervous and obsessive this time. But I feel that I was really lucky because Dr. McMaster set me up, and I'm gonna ask you to give me a little patience to tell you some history, because it's a long way from 1860 to 1912. And when Ron first told me he was going to do this, he essentially sent out a kind of a list of political conventions and said, which ones do you want to do? And we were going to pick 3 of them. And there was a 4th I really wanted. Okay, so I'm going to sneak it in today because I know that we don't have time, but I hadn't thought about it. But what's been evolving since Dr. McMaster started is a kind of a history of American political parties. And some of you know that I kind of have a backdrop in that. And I've taught some classes in the history of the party system. And as usual, I want to give you the books because I'm old fashioned. The way I think about political parties actually comes from a book that I encountered as an undergraduate that I thought was really the sanest way to think about the interaction of political parties and the outer environment, if you want to think about it this way. And the name of the book is American Political Parties, and probably it's out of date now. The author was C. Everett Ladd, and I still have my tattered copy of it, and it still makes sense to me. And as Dr. McMaster started talking, I realized that I kind of wanted to go back to that to talk about the modern conventions. And two things from Ladd that I want to kind of start with today. One is, so Ladd has a history of the American political party system. And he uses it to talk about presidential elections, which is why the issue of political conventions is a prominent one in this book. But so a lot of what I have to say is from the point of view of a focus on how the party system explains presidential elections, what happens in the party system that makes particular candidates viable or not. But the big idea that underlies Ladd's work that I hold to all the time is that political parties and governmental leaders do not set the agenda. What they do is to grapple with whatever is bubbling up from social or cultural or economic changes in the greater environment. In a very real sense, in a country like America, the agenda is set out in the environment, and then the government and the parties try to figure out what they can do about it. And the story that Dr. McMaster has told you in 3 sessions is, and he ended absolutely perfectly, is how both party systems, or both political parties, from what I think of as the first party system, were absolutely destroyed by their inability to grapple with the issue of slavery. Okay. The Whig convention, the Whigs were killed first, and then I believe his last words last week were, and the convention of 1860 destroyed the Democratic Party as a political force. And that's exactly where I want to pick up. The first party system up to the American Civil War was essentially dominated by the Democratic Party in one form or another. If you know party history, Jackson took over the Jeffersonian base and produced the modern Democratic Party in the late 1820s on that base. So from Jefferson through the American Civil War, in terms of presidential elections, the Democrats basically dominate. Well, the issue of slavery and the American Civil War really did destroy the Democratic Party, and not just for a couple of years. Here's the other part of Ladd's story in the American political parties. We always have two parties, and there's a structural reason for that. I spend lots and lots and lots of time talking about how there's never going to be three major parties in the United States. System, the way it's structured, can't sustain that. And that's a matter for a much longer discussion. But here's the deal. Ladd points out that the two political parties never compete evenly. One has a tendency to dominate for a long period of time. And guess what? It's the one that grapples most effectively with whatever those major things are that are bubbling up from social ferment, cultural ferment, economic change. Okay. So one party grasps kind of the dominant consensus, not just for a year or two, but these tend to be blocks that last about 40 years. And in terms of presidential elections, and I'm going to throw this out and then I won't go back to it. One of the things Ladd says is that when you're in a period where the parties compete pretty evenly in presidential elections, first you get a Democratic president, then you get a Republican president. In those periods, what that really means is that it's the 1840s, and there's some elephant sitting in the living room that both parties are trying not to grapple with. And that the one that ends up grappling with it most effectively ends up as kind of the dominant party for the next 20 or 30 years. So Dr. McMaster told you that the Democrats and their dominance of early America were killed dead by the American Civil War. And since both of the existing major parties were killed by their inability to grapple with that issue, the Republican Party emerged as the dominant party in the next phase of American history. And if you remember what you were taught about them, they didn't even exist until 1852. They were part of a coalition that arose to oppose the extension of slavery into the Western territories. It's like a single issue third party that comes out of this as a winner. Okay. But the war gives them a whole new lease on life in two ways. We are so far away from this that it's inconceivable. It was even inconceivable to my students at Santa Fe when I used to say it. But one of the ways the Republican Party was kept in power was by doing what was called waving the bloody shirt, reminding everybody in America that those nasty Southerners had started the Civil War and that they had won it, and that and the reason I say that you can't understand that, I mean, the impact of that is that the American Civil War killed off more Americans than any other single combat activity in the history of our country, by about 3 times as many casualties. And almost everyone, North or South, had someone that was engaged in that enterprise. And if your son or your nephew or your cousin or your husband wasn't outright dead, then you got up every morning and got to look at them with their amputated limbs. Whole towns were full of people who were gravely wounded in the war. And so when you reminded people about it, it was had a kind of a visceral immediacy that Americans can't even contemplate. And in fact, every president, every Republican president and presidential candidate up to Teddy Roosevelt had been in the Union Army, every single one of them. So waving the bloody shirt was a part of it. But the other part of it is that while the war was going on, you know, a lot of other nifty stuff was happening, like the industrial might of the North, in order to wage that war, let it come out as the absolute top economic power on the planet. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad sort of allowed the Republican Party to go from a party that emerged to oppose slavery in the territories to what it became for the next almost 50 years, the party of industrialization. And, you know, I love teaching at Santa Fe, and one of the reasons why was my students often ask me really incredible questions. And one day I was talking about the corruption of politics in the post-Civil War period. And one of my students raised his hand and he said, Ms. Waller, it seems to me that the politicians in the pre-Civil War era were less corrupt. They were much more public regarding, you know, how is that an accurate picture? And I thought about it for about 2 seconds. And I said, yes, it absolutely is. And here's why. Before the American Civil War, there wasn't enough money in America to corrupt politics on the level of the corruption in the post-Civil War era. And that is absolutely true. If you think about the rise of the great industrialists, all those industrial fortunes were made during the war. During the war. We don't want to call J.P. Morgan and people like that war profiteers, but it is absolutely true that the scale of industrialization and corporate wealth was created by the American Civil War. So the Republican Party won the war, And they won the peace as well by continuing to support industrialization. And politics were extremely corrupt, and everything was pretty much bent toward what corporate wealth and the industrializers wanted. When I was doing this, I was thinking about the fact that there are some parallels between the periods that the period that I'm talking about and what is going on in America today. But as far as I know, nobody appears on the floor of the Senate and gives out $100 bills publicly in exchange for votes. And those were actually the sorts of things that went on in the post-Civil War period. So industrialization happened. And as you know, that ushered in huge waves of social, cultural, and economic change. And just for starters, you guys know this. Young people don't. Immigration is not a new issue. Okay. Between 1880 and 1920, 32 million immigrants came to America to work in those factories. And they came and lived and worked in horrendous conditions that one time I assigned the jungle, old fashioned, assigned the jungle to my students in AMH 2020. And one of my students, a young woman, walked into the room 24 hours after she finished it. She threw the book down on the table. She said, "That is the most disgusting thing I have ever read. How could you make us feel so awful about it?" And when I was doing this, I thought about the Woke Act. Okay. I violated it with Upton Sinclair in the 1890s because she was simply appalled by what she read in that book. So industrialization brings great prosperity. It brings waves of immigration. It brings all kinds of social and cultural change. And it is dominated by Republican machines, locally, statewide, and generally at the national level, that do not believe in regulation or reform. Here comes the convention that I wanted to talk about. Okay. There was a response to all of this, but it wasn't exactly the response that you might have expected. And that response, and this is worth a whole course. I go back to this constantly as I watch what's going on in America right now. That response was the populist movement. Okay. And it was the last gasp of agrarian America in a political sense. At the end of Dr. McMaster's talk last week, I wrote down two things. and one was the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society that was happening and in people's faces in the 1890s. And the populist movement, which was the response to the hideousness of industrialization and the growth of the cities and all those foreigners who probably drank and were Catholics, and all of those social and cultural tensions that that had to do with the economic transition fundamentally, were sort of brought to a head by America's agrarian sector that didn't prosper, didn't share in the prosperity, because corporations wanted cheap food for all those industrial workers in the city. And so you didn't want a free market in that, for sure. And but farmers perennially in debt, losing their land, watching the cities grow. You might think of the populist movement as fueled not just by economic conditions, but by a loss of cultural hegemony. Farmers were the backbone of America before the Civil War. After the American Civil War, for the first time, they're not in the majority. And now there's modern order, science, efficiency, urban growth, lots of things that that sort of make the populists. I said today to somebody, I never thought about it this way, but when the populists actually take over the Democratic Party, which they do in the convention in 1896, it's as if an odd combination of the Bernie bros and right-wingers had suddenly taken over one of the major political parties. Populists are economically radical and socially conservative, culturally conservative in an incredible way. They call for cutting off immigration. And in 1896, with the greatest orator of the age, William Jennings Bryan, at the head, they go from a very powerful third party in the West to taking over the Democratic Party. And if Dr. McMaster thought that slavery doomed them in 1860, William Jennings Bryan doomed them for another 40 years in 1896 because the anti-immigration plank caused urban workers, many of whom were immigrants, not to attach themselves. And by 1900, anyone who was connected with industry, even industrial workers, were basically Republicans. And you guys know, if you don't know about 1896, read about it. You know, William McKinley, who wasn't much of a personality, when somebody said to him, how are you going to campaign against William Jennings Bryan, who was the greatest orator of his age? McKinley said, I'm not. I'm going to sit on my front porch and people can come to me. that was exactly what happened. And if you look at the statistics, actually, Bryan did not do badly in that election at all, given how much against the currents of modernity he was actually moving. But the fact that that sort of dying agrarian base had taken over the Democratic Party pretty much doomed it. The populists, I used to do a thing in my classes at Santa Fe where I took all the great reform movements in American history after the Civil War. And I showed my students how long it took for some of what had been advocated by one group to be put into effect by another. And where the populists were concerned, they advocated things like a minimum wage. You know, that does not happen until the New Deal. But a number of the things that the populists advocated were put into effect rather rapidly by the next rising social movement. And by about 1900, progressivism had begun to sort of sweep the country. The progressive movement is a really unusual thing. It was active at every single level of government, local, state. There were whole progressive states. I used to say to my students, so Franklin Roosevelt, he gets elected in 1932. He goes to Washington and he wakes up one morning and he says, I think I'm going to make a woman Secretary of Labor. Let's just choose Frances Perkins. You know, I said, is that how this happens? And of course, my students didn't understand that New York had been a hotbed at a state level of progressivism since 1900. It had been one of the states where the progressive movement had made absolutely the greatest legislative changes. And Frances Perkins had been in the state government in New York when Franklin Roosevelt was governor. He did not just wake up one morning and go, gee whiz, time for a woman. And there were some states, New York, and disparate states, New York and Minnesota. Couldn't think of two more different places. And both of those states were hotbeds of the progressive movement. So that began to take hold nationally. And I have to say, America's slow to change. It began to take hold nationally because of a rising tide of hideous violence that disturbed people. The labor conflicts of the late 1890s are nasty, bloody, and the workers always lose. Cities were overcrowded, hideously unsanitary. People could look around and go, whoa, we have problems. And the progressive movement, which again, I think of these things as bubbling up from the people and then hitting government later. By about 1900, the violence had begun to be scary, and both parties had begun to flirt with various kinds of solutions. The the progressive part, the progressives, I think, were successful in a lot of ways because their emphasis was on order, cleanliness, and efficiency rather than radicalism in a lot of ways. But a thing that spurred them on, I mean, I never forget this. I'm getting ready to close on Teddy Roosevelt. When Teddy Roosevelt was made the vice presidential candidate in 1900, everybody says, oh, he got that way because he was a popular war hero. And that was true. But he had been governor of New York. He had been police commissioner in New York City. It wasn't like he woke up one morning with no political experience. And he very quickly, because he was well educated and articulate and a good writer, became kind of a popular hero and began to champion the reforms that the progressive movement actually went for, although less government regulation than many progressives might have liked. But I never forget that, when he was nominated for vice president by the Republican convention in 1900, Mark Hanna, who was the real head of the Republican Party and was so corrupt and dirty that they knew they couldn't run him, they chose McKinley because McKinley was a clean front for the Ohio gang. When they nominated Teddy Roosevelt for vice president, Hannah said, oh my God, they put a madman a heartbeat away from the presidency. And then, of course, McKinley was assassinated, which was really an accurate call. But when I think about 1900, Teddy Roosevelt was shot by an assassin while he was making a speech. And he went right on and finished the speech. And it was manly work there, and then went to a hospital and got bandaged up. But another one of those things that's kind of lost to history is how close revolution looked in the early 1900s. There was a huge fear of it already, all those anarchists coming from Europe and all the labor people, labor unions are a communist conspiracy in 1900. And then, public figures are shot. Teddy Roosevelt as a vice presidential candidate, and then ultimately William McKinley. So Roosevelt becomes president, and there's never a poll of American historians that doesn't put Roosevelt in as one of the 10 greatest presidents in American history. When he takes office, he's the youngest president ever to be elected, or not elected, but ever to take office. He's a wildly popular Spanish-American War hero. And he's the first president since Andrew Jackson, who actually sees the job of president as kind of a representative of all the people. He's famous for having called the presidency a bully pulpit. Someone said to him, what do you think the president should do? And he said, you should use the presidency as a bully pulpit for justice, for fairness, for equity. He actually meant all that. So he took office, and he, in many ways, accomplished what I think of as his three biggest non-bully pulpit goals. He made the United States, first of all, a player in international affairs for the first time really in American history. America had benefited greatly from isolation. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president who probably grasped globalism in ways that didn't just have to do with trade. Okay. Other presidents could sell goods, but Roosevelt understood that America probably was going to play a greater role. And then the thing he's beloved for, and the thing that causes, the cartoon, okay, that causes trouble in the convention of 1912 is that Teddy Roosevelt, besides the bully pulpit, has another phrase that I really like. Someone said, it can go later. Someone said, how do you envision the presidency? And he said, the president is the steward of the country. Maybe somebody in this room knows about stewards in the Middle Ages. My students at Santa Fe had no earthly idea what that meant, of course. But on medieval feudal estates, there was a person called the steward. And that person's job was to look out for the land and all the resources, and to make sure they were conserved and delivered fairly to everyone on the estate. And when Teddy Roosevelt said the president should be the steward of the country, he was thinking about the land and the natural resources. And when Teddy Roosevelt came in, he established the first national parks and national forests. When he came in, there were none. When he left, there were 12 in 7 years. And he was the first president to grasp that left to its own devices, industrialization would destroy the land. Okay. Climate change was some distance away, but he understood perfectly well the necessity for conserving America's natural resources. So conservation, international affairs, and last but not least, economic justice. One of the ironies of his beef with Taft is that Taft is actually a greater trust buster than Roosevelt himself. Teddy Roosevelt it did not go up against the corporations in quite the same way Taft did. But he was the first American president not to automatically side with corporate owners in labor disputes. And his method, you guys probably know, was to call everybody in and sit at the table and say, you people are going to have to come to some solution that seems equitable to me, or we'll regulate you. And generally speaking, that worked pretty well. So Roosevelt had a very, very successful first term. He ran on his own in 1904 and again had a remarkably successful presidency. I don't know if you people ever think about stuff like this, but Teddy Roosevelt's famous for that speak softly and carry a big stick thing. If you read about Roosevelt's time as presidency, he didn't speak softly. He did carry a big stick. He waved it around a lot, but he never used it. Okay? America, generally speaking, except for the unfortunate theft of Panama, generally was verbally active in international affairs, but not militarily. So he beefed up the military, didn't use it. Big stick, waved it around a lot. And people were smart enough not to call him on it. But he really had a very, very successful term on his own. And then people said, gee, do you want to run again? You know, and he said, no, I've actually had 7 years. Okay, so remember, there's no limit on presidential terms at this point in time. He absolutely could have run again. He said, no, my health isn't good. I've served long enough. I've got somebody I think will do a good job. That would be William Howard Taft, who really did a good job on the U.S. Supreme Court, but didn't like the presidency very much at all. And so Roosevelt said, no, I'm not going to run again, and essentially said to the Republican Party, my friend Taft, go ahead and nominate him. And they did, and Teddy Roosevelt went off to Africa, where if you've ever been to his house, and I have to say it's one of my favorite presidential homes that there is. He must have shot 2/3 of the country, though. There's more dead animals in that house than I ever saw it anywhere. And he went off to Africa on a safari, and Taft started his term. And as I indicated, in terms of economic regulation, he actually made Roosevelt look kind of soft. The problem was that he opened up some of the newly created national forests to mining and lumbering interests. And when his own when Roosevelt's chief forester, who was Roosevelt's friend, Gifford Pinchot, was fired by Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, Roosevelt felt betrayed and went pretty ballistic. And he decided that he would run against Taft for the nomination in 1912. When he came back from that safari in Africa, a reporter asked him about his desire to run now, and the fact that he had said in 1904 that in 1908, that his health was not good. And Roosevelt looked at him and said, oh no, now that I've had a rest, I feel as fit as a bull moose, which turned out to be a fateful turn of phrase. So the Republican convention in 1912 rolled around. And by that time, what had been a warm personal relationship between Taft and Roosevelt had deteriorated hideously to this degree. Okay. At the 1912 convention, William Howard Taft said, "You cannot nominate Teddy Roosevelt. He is the greatest menace to our institutions that we have had in a long time." That's a polite way of calling him a commie. Okay, that was what Taft said about Roosevelt. Roosevelt responded by saying, "Taft is the candidate of the forces of reaction and political crookedness." Right there in the convention. Okay. But the Taft people had the mechanisms of the Republican Party, and they had control of the administration of the convention and of the selection of delegates. Okay. Believe me, when I was thinking about that this week, this went into a whole different perspective for me than I've ever thought about it before. Ultimately, Taft was nominated pretty easily because the mainstream Republicans had the control of the convention. And Roosevelt claimed they had stolen delegates from him out of a number of different states. Different states choose their delegates different ways and always have. And by 1912, there were a few states that had primaries, and Roosevelt had won pretty much all of them. He was wildly popular as a president in the whole country. And so the primary states where the Republican Party had primaries went for Roosevelt, and some of those delegates had their credentials stripped by the Republican Party in the convention. So Teddy Roosevelt might have been the first president ever to claim that an election had been stolen from him. In this case, it was his own party's nomination rather than the election. Although I think it's safe to say this, political scientists are not allowed to make predictions because we're not real scientists. Historians are using 20/20 hindsight. But I think that it's safe to say that if Roosevelt had been the Republican nominee, Woodrow Wilson would never have become president in 1912. But Taft got the nomination, and Roosevelt was so angry that he decided to run on a third-party ticket. On a third-party ticket. Okay. So this cartoon that's coming up here. Okay. I used to, this cartoon used to be I taught in the dual enrollment program at Santa Fe for a while, my only foray into teaching high school when I was a part-timer. And I used to put this cartoon on my American history students' exam and ask them to interpret it for me. And one of my students quite literally wrote, "Oh, that creature that seems to be a deer is biting the elephant's butt." And I never could figure out whether I should give literal points for that answer or not, because that is what's happening. But you can see this is a perfect reproduction of what occurs in the election of 1912. Taft is riding the Republican elephant, and Teddy Roosevelt is riding his bull moose. I am as fit as a bull moose. No, it's not a deer. And he's holding the elephant back. And you can see literally the Democratic donkey is like winning by a nose, literally. And that is exactly the way it came down. In the presidential election, Taft got the least number of votes, and Roosevelt took enough votes from him to ensure that Woodrow Wilson became president. And that had a number of pluses and minuses for the country. But because of the Republican convention of 1912, Republican dominance is interrupted for 8 years. And then the country goes straight back to 3 Republican presidents in the 1920s, and Republican dominance does not end until the industrial economy runs smack into a brick wall called the Great Depression. And that's the story. I love this cartoon.
Thank you, Donna. Any questions, folks? Anybody have any comments? This was a great bonus to get the background to 1912. Wouldn't you agree?
I couldn't figure out how to leap from 1860 to 1912, but the conventions, by 1912, public opinion is beginning to be a factor in the conventions in a way that it hasn't been before. And that's what allows Roosevelt to do this.
Yeah. Here's a question here.
I'm pretty loud. My question has to do, you said that doing this caused you to rethink some things you had thought about. I'm immediately thinking of all the shenanigans that now seem to be going on with delegate selection.
Okay, well, the last ones were delegates of a different kind. But the bottom line is that, and this is a story that I'm going to tell you next week. In 1952, in the 1950s, the way that political party delegates are chosen begins to change. And I don't want to give anything away, but some of you already know this. 1952 is the last open political convention. And what I mean by that is it's the last convention where nomination actually takes place at the convention. And the candidates are not decided going into the convention. After 1952, and certainly after 1968, there are no surprises at the conventions, and that's because of the rise of primaries. And that's changed the whole delegate game in a lot of different ways. That's why, by the way, that's why the Republicans felt free to, and this is really how I thought about it this time around, they felt free to just sort of dispense with their convention. Okay, because I'm a political scientist, I'm an obsessive convention watcher. Every 4 years, I'm there watching all the up and comers and what's going on and stuff like that. And I was really stunned by essentially the assessment of the Republican Party this last time around, that the convention was sort of an unnecessary ceremony. Even though primaries choose most of the delegates now, conventions have purposes. And I thought you could see that the Democrats knew kind of what the purpose was. And the Republicans just acted like it was a media event that they could just sort of not pay much attention to. It's very interesting. Yeah.
I'll ask you to hazard a guess. Do you think if Ivanka's father does not get the nomination in 2024, he might mount a third party run like Roosevelt did in 1912?
So
Okay, I almost was candid here, and I just bit myself back. And I'll go ahead and be candid. My fondest hope, my fondest hope is what you just described. Certainly, I haven't seen a candidate more capable of making that choice in my lifetime. And that could be, and you saw the cartoon, okay, that would, I have to be candid. I think we're in a period, I mentioned to you about Ladd. I think we're in a period of party realignment now. And that's what happens when a big political crisis makes that domination sort of flip over. And those are periods when anything can happen, and you do get those sorts of things, third-party candidates. But third-party candidates never win. They do best, okay, when they're former presidents, okay? That's happened a couple of times. And, but I have been watching the party system going, okay, which party is gonna die? When realignments happen, okay, sometimes party dominance shifts, but sometimes a party dies and is replaced by another one. Think the Whigs and then the coalition that puts together the Republicans in early America. Okay, so I look at America now and I go, oh, which one is going to die, or are they just going to flip dominance? What I will say about what you just said is if the Republican Party has fierce and contentious primaries that resulted in that, my vote is that's the party that dies. Could take them right out of the game for sure. So I'm sure they're all praying he doesn't. I'm sure they're all praying he doesn't.
All right, we have a couple questions here on Zoom.
Okay.
Is that okay? Shirley, go ahead.
Oh, Donna, this was so great. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
You know,
Yes.
it's so wonderful to hear your recalling history to us, where we don't have that picture and all we do is emote from moment to moment. I think we all ought to go back and sign up for your course.
Oh, that was a fan letter.
Very, very enlightening to hear your perspective. and have an understanding of what we're going through, and this will also pass. We've been here before.
Well, you know, somebody asked me the other day why I do this. And to be honest with you, until I started going back and thinking about that, I had not thought about contemporary parallels. I just went, oh, I'm going to do 1912. And it wasn't until I took out the books and started thinking. And one of the reasons I love to do this is it forces me to go back and rethink a piece of history that I've talked about. You know, I probably haven't talked about Teddy Roosevelt in 15 years. And you go back and everything has changed and it looks different in contemporary perspective. And that's definitely true.
And it feels so healthy. Thank you very much.
One more.
All right,
One more.
John, go ahead.
Always a pleasure to hear you. You brought up the recent Republican convention, and I was wondering about platforms. Have they always been presented at conventions? Were there platforms in 1912? Because I know the Republican convention in 2020, and I don't even think in 2016 had a platform. I don't know about 2016.
I don't think that ever happened before. I really don't ever recall a convention that didn't have a platform committee. And that's been true since before the Civil War. You know, that's what I meant when I said the Republicans, there were purposes to conventions, even if they don't choose the candidates. And one of them is writing the platform so that, you know what party candidates at all levels are supposed to be subscribing to. And no, I don't think that ever happened before since political conventions started. I found it shocking. I was very surprised by it.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question, and then we're going to be out of time, but we'll here we go. Sure.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating to get that big overview. As a person with deep roots in the agrarian South, as I listen to you, my impression, and please agree with me or disagree with me, is that the South was quite irrelevant for some good length of time politically after the Civil War.
Under military occupation until 1877, I too am a rural Southerner, and I grew up in a world where it was the war between the states, by the way. No. My family was a little on my paternal side. They were a little bit ahead of that, but not fun. And my mother was a Northerner, so even if they thought that, they couldn't have said it. You know, they couldn't have said it. But yes, under military occupation till 1877. Things that what you just said made a bunch of. So the Transcontinental Railroad had connected the North and the Midwest to the West Coast, not the South. There was no New Orleans train at all. The South was a backwater struggling with its, think about 1898. Okay. That's a year, and that's 1896 is Plessy versus Ferguson. So the South is resegregating, trying to pull itself out of the economic backwater. The statistic I was struggling to pull up is that I want to say that in 1896 in the South, cotton production was a third of what it had been in 1832. So, there's already been a migration north of African Americans into the industrial labor force. And that's so large that by the 1920s, you've got the Harlem Renaissance, and the South is simply there in a political sense. Although in the Congresses in the 1890s, the Southerners play a good deal of a role in, as they always do, in sort of conservative coalitions. But there's a reason they call that movement in the 30s the New South movement. And that's because between the 1930s and the end of the Civil War, Southerners are just not players in any sense. Right. And, I would think about what I said about the Republicans waving the bloody shirt. The last Union soldiers leave the South in 1877. It's like an occupied territory. So, no. But as you have seen, now we're the Sun Belt, and we have risen again. So.
Thank you, Donna. Next week, as Donna indicated, we're moving up to 1952, and she's already given you a little preview on what that convention looked like. The other thing that I'm sure she'll emphasize is platform really mattered. It
was all about platform.
It was about the soul of the Republican Party and where it was really going to go. And I think you'll really enjoy it. So we'll see you next week. Thanks, Donna.